They used 2 nails in his feet. They put one foot flat against the upright, the way we've always imagined it. They drove a nail in diagonally, just below his ankle. It came out through his heel. They put the other foot on top of it and nailed the 2 of them together, lower down, through the instep. He ended up by taking 2 nails through one foot and 1 through the other. Loads of fun. But Dr. Gambisi approved with skeletons that that's the only way it could be done and make it work. If they'd used a single nail, the way we've always imagined it, the way the artists have shown it, the victim would have thrown his weight against it only once to push himself up and breathe. He would never do it the second time. Like the palm, the bones would have separated. It would have been over much too quickly to make the Romans happy. And this was intended to be the ultimate death. It wasn't. It came awfully close to it. The man in the shroud has an elliptical wound of about 4 centimeters between the 5th and 6th rib on the right. Is it a coincidence that 4 centimeters is the size of a Roman lance head? Whatever made it, lance, spear, javelin, penetrated diagonally upward and it went to his heart. A huge amount of blood that could only have come from the heart, as well as a thin watery substance, more water than blood, flowed out of the wound, separated, flowed across his back. The doctors say it proves 2 things. The man in the shroud did not die the usual crucifixion death of suffocation. Neither, of course, did he die of crura fracture, smashing the bones of his thighs with a club so that he couldn't push himself up to breathe. He died of cardiac arrest. His heart just stopped, for whatever reason. He was dead before the weapon went in. Who does it sound like? We had to do what I honestly don't believe has ever been done before. We had to look at the Bible in a totally unique manner. Tom DeMahala woke up in Italy one night in a cold sweat, rolled off of his cot, grabbed the clipboard, started to run. The one thing that nobody had thought to choreograph before the team left the States. His thought, what if everybody but him turned out to be a Roman Catholic? Seriously, can you see the headlines? Bias, prejudice. They made up their mind before they left the States. The team actually turned out to have been about 20% Roman Catholic, every mainline Protestant denomination, some non-mainline, Mormons and Orthodox Jews. But many said that that's only the way they were brought up as kids. In actuality, they were agnostic. Maybe God's real, maybe he's not, who knows, who cares, we don't need him anyway. An agnostic. But we have to look at the Bible not as atheists or agnostics or cynics or skeptics, not even as believers. The 2 or 3 of us that might have had the guts in '78 to stand up in public and say that we were believers had to be the devil's advocates. We had to look at the Bible strictly as research people. That's what I mean unique. This may truly be the first time in 2,000 years that anyone has ever gotten into that book without trying to prove something. And we weren't trying to prove a thing. We were not trying to prove it right, nor were we trying to prove it wrong. We couldn't have cared less. All we wanted were the answers to a couple of questions that in 1978 seemed to be good ones. Still do. Does that book say anything about a cloth with an image on it, or the mechanism that might have produced the image? Because I think you would believe that if this thing were really around in the 1st century, somebody should have recorded it. And yet on the surface, that's not the case. We had to take the entire crucifixion resurrection story apart, almost a word at a time, in the original languages, only looking for answers to our own questions. Go back as far as we possibly could, read everything we could find. Philo, Eusebius, Irenaeus, Polycarp, Flavius Virginius Renatus, the entire Jewish Talmud. There's a beauty for you. I'm not sure I really recommend it, but it's an experience reading it. 18,000 pages of Jewish law that jumps from one subject to the other on every single page, and there's no index. Guess who got that job? Oy vey. And that's a good Jewish term that means exactly that, oy vey. I've got the greatest collection of useful information you could ever ask for. I could tell you how to kosher meat, hang on a phylactery, burn a girl who's been caught in adultery, or bury somebody according to 1st century Jewish law. But you see, facts, truth, is the name of the game. Tradition is worthless. I know there are people here tonight that would disagree with that totally. But tradition cannot be trusted. More times than not, it's been proven to be a daydream, we'll say. You've got to get truth. You've got to get facts. No matter how long it takes, no matter how much it costs. Truth is really the name of the game. Even if it meant reading 18,000 pages word by word, and it did. But we had to start at the very beginning with a mysterious character who comes out of the woodwork a few hours after Jesus died. Mysterious in the sense that he's totally unheard of before, but awfully important to us, Because all four biographers of Jesus tell us, and if you don't know it, you should, that if any 3 or 4 of us were to walk up into the road tonight and witness an automobile accident, if we each did an article on it, if our stories were to agree, and anyone cared enough to read them, then by the laws of external evidence, what we've written is history. 3 or 4 people witness a current event, they agree, they record it, they agree, it's historical fact. All 4 biographers of Jesus tell us that Joseph of Arimathea showed up in Jerusalem a few hours after Jesus died, carrying under his arm what you girls would call a length of piece goods. A piece of cloth that could be used to make a coat, a robe, a jacket, or bury somebody in it. It's usually translated shroud, and that's not a bad translation. We still know very little about Joe. Arimathea is nothing but a bump on top of a hill a few miles north of Jerusalem. He was wealthy. He was a rabbi. He was in politics because he was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. He had the title of Counselor of Israel. That's where we stopped. In ancient Israel, there had only been 14 counselors. They had to be members of the Sanhedrin, yes, but it went far beyond that. If anything were to have happened to the high priest of Israel to cause him to be incapacitated in any way whatsoever, it would be one of those 14 counselors that took his place. That means that that night, as the old man was hustling across the streets of Old Jerusalem, the shadows lengthening around him, a bolt of cloth under his arm, his life in his hands, every Jewish person that recognized him bowed before him. This was the elite, the aristocracy of Israel, one of the 15 most important men in the entire nation come to get the body of Jesus. With him was a man even older than he was. I doubt very much that there's anybody in this room tonight who's given any serious consideration to where you're going to be buried. I think you have to be a certain age before you worry about that foolishness. I couldn't care less. Joe had already had his grave dug. He was not a kid. Nicodemus was probably older than he was. Wealthy, rabbi, Sanhedrin, teacher of Israel. That was no small title in the first century. And gutsy. 2 of the gutsiest men that we've ever read about. One writer, Mark, said that they had to screw up their courage before they went to Pilate, the Roman governor of Israel, to ask for the body of Jesus. I've got money that says they did. Their knees must have been knocking together like tambourines when they walked into the praetorium that night, the governor's palace, because for practical purposes they had committed suicide. Pilate turned out to have been something less than a human being. He was an animal, a beast. He's a man that did that to women and kids, loads of them. He made an unbelievable number of dead people. He was one of the very few Roman governors from anywhere that was ever recalled to Rome for excessive brutality. And that wasn't excessive brutality. That's only what you did to a non-Roman. The penalty for scourging a Roman citizen was execution. There was no law to protect the non-Roman. You could do anything you wanted to do to them. Pilate did that to babies. Ultimately, the Emperor Gaius ordered him home, found him guilty of excessive brutality, and suggested that it might be nice if he fell on his own sword and committed suicide. If he didn't do it, the legion could help him. Eusebius tells us how he did it. Philo wrote his book around the year 50 down in Alexandria. He described Pilate as a man of a stubborn, obnoxious, hateful, rebellious, spiteful disposition. He had nothing good to say about him. A man whose governorship was characterized by briberies, extortions, executions without trial beyond number. An absolutely lovable individual who wouldn't have thought twice about crucifying 2 old men on the next 2 crosses going up. Because that night, when they asked for the body of Jesus, in effect, they were really saying that they were either relatives or family, followers, disciples, believers, anything you might want to call them, in a man that Pilate had just had put to death as an enemy of the state. In other words, they were saying that they were enemies of the state. Of course their knees were knocking together. Who wouldn't be? Fortunately for them, Pilate was more interested in the fact that Joe was trying to say Jesus was dead. And he knew better. He knew that nobody died in 6 hours on any cross. It couldn't possibly have been over 8 or 9 hours since Jesus had stood in front of him. He had condemned it to death, allowing for the time that it takes to actually walk across Old Jerusalem, crucify someone. Jesus couldn't possibly have been hanging on the cross for much over the 6 hours that John said he was. And here's Joe trying to say he's dead? Pilate would never buy that one. And I can't really blame him. You see, the shortest recorded crucifixion that we could find took 36 hours, dying by inches. The longest recorded crucifixion we could find took 9 days. The vast majority of crosses, I believe that includes his, were not raised above the ground.